Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon EOS 10D. This camera is the one that, started the 10D all the way to the 90D line. Of course, it's not the first double-digit camera from Canon. That's going to be digitally, that's not the first digital camera from Canon. It's the D30, I believe that is. But since this camera is really old now and you can pick it up for really cheap, and in general you can still take really nice images with it, I just thought, why not do a video about it? So without further ado, let's get into the video. So recently I just picked up this camera for around 40 euros, and at first I wasn't really expecting much. Obviously the lens didn't come with it, but what came with it was like 3 memory cards, one 1GB, one 2GB, and one 512 megabytes. Can you believe the time when, or even remember the time, if you're old enough, like when 512 megabyte card, CF card, was actually the standard storage? I mean, when I first got into photography, like 4GB was like kind of the standard. And then very quickly people started using 8, 32, 64 gigs SD cards, and then slowly SDHC came and SDXC and things like that. So yeah, I'm not that old, by the way, even though I look old. Anyway, in this video, it's not a review video, but because I like this camera so much, and yeah, I just feel like making this video, and also this camera is very cheap, so that's why I just like to make this video based on my opinion on this camera. This camera is not technologically advanced when compared to, modern cameras or even cameras from like a few years ago, because this is a camera that came out, I believe, in 2003. So yeah, I believe it has a 6 megapixel sensor. It's definitely more megapixels than my original 1D, which I actually have used to take some events photos with, like paid client events photos. Believe it or not, I actually did a video on that. So in this video, I'll be talking about the ergonomic side of this camera, which covers the ergonomics and the operational side of this camera, and then go into the photography side, and then I'll talk about my conclusion on this camera, on what I think and everything. Again, this is not a review video. I just would like to talk about this camera because I like it so much, and it's part of my camera collection now. And I also like to make this video, and like, in case it helps anyone really to decide on getting this camera, or decide on getting, like, whether they should spend money on getting new gear, or better like save some money and still spend it on some of the older gears and invest in other areas like lenses, things like that. So yeah, first, ergonomics and operation. This camera feels very grippy and very tough and heavy to a certain extent. Like, if you just take the lens off, I don't really care if I'm not one of those sensitive people who's like, oh my god, the dust will get in. No, it's okay. It's a CMOS sensor. It doesn't attract dust that much. But still, dust will get in at some point. But anyway, it's not like that's hard to clean a sensor. It's very easy to clean the sensor for me. I have the sensor cleaning kit. Anyway, the ergonomics of this camera, as I said, it's very grippy. It's very very big. It feels very big. Even though my 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, and my other 5D cameras and everything, they feel roughly the same size, I just feel like the grip is not as deep as my 5D, 7D series of cameras, things like that. And obviously the buttons, they feel a little bit different, and the layout is a little bit different. I much prefer with the later Canon cameras when the light button is around at the end here, when the light button on this camera is at the very up point here, which is a little bit harder to reach. It's not so much that I can say about the ergonomics of this camera. All I can say is it just feels very beefy, and but the buttons are really tactile and they feel very responsive. Even if you have gloves on, I still think like you will be able to get the confirmation that you hit the button. But one thing that I'm not used to is when I turn on the camera, it will just say EOS on top, and then it just goes into the last settings that I set the camera to. Whereas my other Canon cameras, it will have some sort of settings or stuff like written here, and it just does not have like a home wallpaper or like a home settings. I can only press info and then it will just give me the basic settings, whereas the newer Canon cameras, the user interface is different. My settings will be nicely on the grid and everything, versus just the general information that, you know, this camera sets. So yeah, there's that. Other point is, well, this camera, because the features on this camera is very, very little. Actually, it is very little. So they didn't really need a lot of buttons. So all the buttons that are on here, even though it seems a lot, but they're all the essential buttons. So it's really, really, really nice. And yeah, I just feel like it's a big camera with a really, really restricted amount of feature sets in the same time. So it makes it somewhat a really pleasant camera to use. And just thinking about the price of like 40 euros, I know I've seen videos on YouTube where people have it like for like 50 euros, 40 euros, $20, things like that. So some people can definitely pay a little bit more, and some people will definitely find like a cheaper one. It's a second-hand market, so the price is not always the same. But I paid for it for like 40 euros, and it also comes with a battery grip as well. So yeah, I think it's still on the budget side of things. But what isn't really so budget is that it takes EF lenses, and of course the more budget EF lenses are from the older days, whereas the newer EF lenses are usually the more expensive ones. So yeah, but for it being like a 6 megapixel, I think it still doesn't really hurt that much to invest in like the older EF lenses, even though they're not really up to the optical quality standards of the more modern EF lenses. But I think being a 6 megapixel, it does not magnify too much into the lens flaws or the lens quality. So there are a lot of the older digital film EF lenses available that will work perfectly fine with the 10D, and they're probably for like a really low price as well. So yeah, I think I found like several zoom lenses which usually start around 28 millimeter focal length and like 28 to 80 or something like that for like less than 30 euros. So overall, as the package, you still have an under 100 euros setup, and you still have enough money to like invest in a second-hand EF 50mm 1.8, which makes it even a nicer deal. So yeah, a DSLR with two really nice lenses for the resolution of the camera, I think that's not bad to have. Other ergonomics, well, I think I have enough ergonomics said, but like yeah, I just like how the buttons and dials feel on this camera. It's very tactile and everything, and I much prefer the wheel here than on my 5D Mark II, because the sound is more satisfying on this particular camera than my 5D Mark II. But the operational side of things is where things get a little bit tricky. So it's definitely not a state-of-the-art camera. So the autofocusing system is not state-of-the-art. It's not fast at all. Will it get the job done? Yes, but do not expect any sports performance out of this camera. But if you're taking landscape, taking cityscapes, and to a certain extent, certain type of street photography, I think that the autofocusing system from this camera is fine. It's actually quick enough. Yeah, so it's still very quick, and if the subject doesn't move a lot, it's also very, very accurate as well. The noise on this camera is, well, the ISO when you use in low light. From the operational side of things, I like how, even though that this camera is an older camera, but it's not like a two-handed operation as the original 1D, even though this is an old camera, because on here I can just press ISO and then move the ISO dial, and yeah, it's just really nice. But what I find when it comes to ISO is using high ISO is not really high to today's standards. So let's say if you're using ISO 800, that's when you'd start to get like certain noise coming in already if you're using it indoors. Outdoors it's fine, ISO 800, but ISO 1600, that's super grainy. It's like modern day 51200 ISO or something like that. So it's really that grainy. But then again, it's probably still okay to clean up and post on certain social media if you don't care too much about that. But yeah, modern days editing software will be able to also make, like, do a good denoising out of it as well, to get a little bit of the grain down to like a more pleasing grain, but the grain will still be there. Yeah. Another operational side of things is how it operates, like in the menu system. Because this camera does not have a lot of features, as I mentioned earlier, the menu system is very simple. You just hit menu, and then you can just really scroll down to so many features. Like, well, so many, like, but all the essential features. And yeah, it is a little bit laggy if you're like really fast with your wheel. And talking about using wheel and fast with the speed is, when it comes to reviewing images, we take it for granted of how instant we can review our images nowadays, but back then with the 10D, the 300D, the original 1D, reviewing images is a little bit on the slow side. So once you press play, the image, it says busy for a while, and then the image pops up, and then you also have to wait until the image loads. And then if you move to another image, it shows the blurry, like, shows a blurry preview, and then you have to wait a couple of seconds until the image gets in focus. So yeah, there's that. And this camera will not take, you know, higher capacity cards than like 2 GB, I think. I could be wrong, but it definitely will not take really high capacity cards. Can you put it in? You can, but it's just not really good for both the card and the actual camera itself, because it was not meant to be used with such high capacity cards. But yeah, that's that. What I find really cute is the flash. It doesn't come very high, but the sound of it, it's kind of like motorized sounding, and when you can actually pull it out without pressing the button, I think. Yeah, there you go. And it's just very, very motorized sounding, and it feels very hydraulic as well. But yeah, it's just a little something I noticed. And the viewfinder is not completely 100% accurate either, so there's that. But many cameras, many DSLRs also doesn't have 100% accurate viewfinder. But it definitely gets the job done. It's on the small side of things, but it's okay. The autofocusing points is only 9 points, I believe. Wait, 3, 4, okay, 7 points. Yeah, so it's definitely not a lot, especially comparing to modern days. But I think it's definitely enough if you're just looking at this camera for what it is and the price that it offers. And I think for general use, landscape, people photography, portraits, and certain type of street photography, it's definitely more than enough, because I'm certainly satisfied with my 5D Mark II's autofocusing system, which only has 9 autofocus points and 1 cross type, and even that still does me pretty well. Obviously that's a tiny bit more advanced than this, but it's not that much more advanced, and it's still a great system that I really like. Anyway, into the photography side of things. As I kind of touched upon earlier, using higher ISO can give you noise, but you can just do noise reduction on it. And yeah, as long as you don't shoot like completely indoors where you need very high ISO, I think it's completely fine. The color science is good. I just find that it's more cool than warm. The more modern Canon cameras are a bit more warm than cool. So it's kind of interesting seeing that this camera produces more like cool looking images temperature wise. And yeah, but it's still really nice. It has a really nice like very typical Canon of like color rendition. Canon always has this really nice color rendition, color depth, but also roll off into the highlights and the shadows. This camera doesn't have a lot of dynamic range for today's standards. Obviously it was like the state of the art back then, like how many photographers actually praised for its, you know, dynamic range and everything compared with film. But in the same time, for today's standards, it's not really high, but the roll-offs are very natural. Now, if I compare it to like, you know, some of the older Sony cameras or some of the older Fuji cameras, their roll-offs are very rough. They might have more dynamic range, which to some can be important. Actually, to many are important, but it just looks weird when the roll-offs into the highlights of the shadows are not natural. Whereas the Canon camera here, the 10D, really old camera now, it has a very, very natural roll-off into both the highlights and the shadows. Can you recover a lot from the highlights and shadows? To a certain extent you can, and also depending on the lighting condition. If you're not photographing like super low light indoors, or if you're not photographing like an extreme sunset without any filters in front of the lens, then I think it will handle it quite okay. And it certainly will be more than enough if you're just putting it up on like Instagram or taking pictures for social media in general, or even your online shop. I think this camera is still a really nice camera to have. I certainly had a lot of fun shooting with this camera because, you know, the shutter sound is kind of very unique. It's still very old. It sounds like one of those Canon film cameras, curtain, and it's just, there's some sort of nostalgic to it, and yeah, there's something about it. Anyway, but yeah, that's pretty much the image quality. Not really a lot to talk about. You cannot really do a lot of crazy crop with this camera, but even though back then like 6 megapixels was like, oh my god, 6 megapixels, that's a lot. That's very high resolution, you know, because it's still in its early days of digital, and even a 3 megapixel medium format camera was like, wow, that's a lot. You don't need that much. And then, yeah, you get the idea. But for now, it's kind of like 6 megapixels, it's nothing. So yeah, you cannot really expect to do a lot of cropping, especially when screens are getting more like resolutions. They're getting higher and higher resolutions. So even zooming into this image can be a little bit tricky, because once you even lightly zoom into it, it gets pixelated because it's only 6 megapixels. But if you're not planning to crop, I think it's still very fine. And it will still do really good prints with this particular resolution from this camera. But yeah, that's it for the photography side of things. So yeah, I guess into the conclusion. I know that this is a very short and easy video to make, but yeah, for the price of around 50 euros, give or take, I think you're really getting a lot of camera here. It does not do video. I mean, and even if it does, I think it would be very jerky and very weird and pixelated. So it doesn't do video. But for photography, as a photography alone camera, it's very nice. The color science is there. The image has a very nice, unique, old look to it, which can be very interesting, but also very nice. But also the raw files are very easy and light to operate and process. What I mean by light is, like, if you're used to like the more modern mirrorless cameras, or the more modern cameras with like very high megapixels and really large file size that actually needs a lot of processing power, this camera doesn't need a lot of processing power at all. It still retains a lot of details and information, but being the resolution, like being such a low resolution, and also not as much information as the more modern cameras, and therefore much lighter files to really operate and process with in post. So yeah, whether you're just a startup online store, or just want to shoot with this camera for fun, or just want to have a backup camera, I think this camera is really great. Obviously it will not shoot good sport, nor if you take it to concerts, it will not really shoot, well, it will shoot concerts, but not really up to the standard of even a camera that was released like 10 years ago. So yeah, this is fun. Yeah, do I recommend it to a lot of people who like to look into the camera in this price range? Yeah, and also to people who just like to have fun with older tech. Yes. Serious really depends. Like, if you're a serious photographer, it really depends on like how serious you are, because if you're just gonna be posing on Instagram and you're just gonna be taking like artistic shots in your room, playing with lights, I think this is still a good camera. But if you're going to be using a lot of dynamic range and extreme harsh lighting condition, then this is not really your camera. If you need autofocusing points, like really a lot of them, and all of them must be very sensitive and quick, then this is also not your camera. Also, yeah, again, if you can live with only an EF mount without the EF-S mount, because there are some nice EF-S lenses for this camera, then, you know, then this camera is also not for you, because there's no like an equivalent to the 10 to 24 or the 10 to 18 millimeter, so you cannot really take super ultra wide with this camera unless if you invest in like the 3,000 euros 11 to 24. I think it's the 11 to 24 L, but obviously if you're looking at that price range, you're not looking at this camera anyway. But yeah, that's enough with me babbling. So that's pretty much my conclusion. If you just want to have fun, I really highly recommend this camera. And it's also a camera that kind of like proves that you don't really need the latest gear to get good images. Given the nice lighting, this camera will produce great images anyway. And being a DSLR, you can change different lenses to have different types of perspective on it anyway. So yeah, there is that. The weather sealing, oh yeah, I forgot to touch on that. It is somewhat weather sealed, but not as weather sealed as even the more modern 40D, 50D, things like that, because there are no like proper gaskets around the SD and the battery cards that I can see, and there's not a little hump like the 40D has on the flash, on the hot shoe here, to make it completely weather seal. But I live here in the Netherlands and our rain here is really harsh, and I've taken it out on like a rainy day and it survived perfectly fine. So take it with a grain of salt on that. Anyway, oh, I accidentally took a picture. Anyway, if you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description below. It's absolutely for free. You don't need to sign up or pay anything. It's just click and download, as well as my 2021 photography guidebook, photography calendar. It's also absolutely for free. Yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Yeah. Till then, bye for now.